A good late afternoon, evening where you guys. That was Nigun Althaus or Althaus by Shlomo Katz from his amazing album Live in Melbourne. How's everybody doing? Let's light up the darkness. Tonight, we welcome James Roth in the house from Indianapolis, Yehudit Sobel from Florence, South Carolina, Paula Schmidt-Klauser from Chicago, Sandy McMurray. Good evening from Michigan. Tom Beck says Lila Toe from Philadelphia. Christo Cheney, greetings again from Lubbock, Texas. Paul Papuzinski from Louisiana. Nancy Brandemel Wright from Southern Pines, North Carolina. Philip Kaufman from Skokie, Illinois. Grace Schiller Curial says shalom from Miami. Great. Jenya Bressler is with us from New York. Brian Bloomfield from Sharon, Massachusetts. Let me just quickly check over here on the YouTube side. Yes, Neil is with us from Virginia. Big thanks again to Neil for the illustrations. Sending me a PDF that we can use here in Tractate Eruvin. Very useful. Maggie Scott with us from Ohio. Mirasia Janut from Atlanta, Georgia. And Lynn with us from Texas. Dro Leibovitz from Israel. Melissa Eitel-Jurin from Great Neck. Oren Mayer from New York. Brian Bloomfield, I said, from Massachusetts. John Shore from Sedona. And Lawrence Polineski says a refuah shlema for my mom, Hava Bat Lillian. May we only hear good news. Your mom, Hava Bat Lillian, should have a refuah shlema, complete healing of body, mind, and spirit. I'd also like to do a dedication, a dedicated shofar blast. We've been blowing the shofar every morning here during this month of Elul, so watch for that live show in the mornings. And we take dedications. Of course, this is Elul. It's a beautiful time, an important time to support charitable causes. Particularly, it's good to support the study and the spread of Torah. So if you want to support Accidental Talmudists, great time to do that. Donate.accidentaltalmudist.com. Sharon Frant Brooks made a very generous donation and says, I would love to dedicate a shofar blowing to the memory of my grandmother, Tilly Frand. Tilla Bas Moshe, her yard site is the 4th of Elul, and her uncle Jacob Frant, Yaakov Yehoshua ben Yeheskel, his yard site is the 5th of Elul, and her beloved mother, Freda Frant, Baila Freda Bas Eliezer, whose yard site is the 5th of Elul. So these are for all the members of your family. Sharon, may their neshamas have a great aliyah. May their memories always be for a blessing. And we also have a beautiful dedication from John Younger for his children and grandchildren. All right. Beautiful, beautiful, beautiful. It's so important to hear the shofar during this month of Elul. In the normal course of things, we would go to morning services if we had services in person, and we would blow the shofar every morning in synagogue. But it's important to hear it every day during this month of Elul as we prepare ourselves to come before the heavenly court for judgment on Rosh Hashanah. As I mentioned every morning, this applies to all people, not just Jews. All of us, our souls come before the heavenly court at the beginning of the year, Rosh Hashanah, where we receive our decree for the coming year. In the coming year, who will live and who will die, who will be healthy, who will not, who will be prosperous, who will not, who will have calamities, who will not, etc. And so just as we want the heavenly court to have compassion on us and grant us a kind decree for the coming year, so we should show that we have compassion on our fellow creatures, and that's why we make tzedakah. We donate tzedakah. We donate to charitable causes, feeding people, clothing people, sheltering people. All these things are beautiful, and organizations that teach Torah, very important in Elul. Okay, so let us get to where we are. We are holding on Daf Yud Hey, or actually Tesvav. We're on page 15 of Tractate Eruvin, the third volume of the Talmud. We are in chapter 1. We're finished today, with God's help, our discussion of the fourth Mishnah, begin and end our discussion of the fifth Mishnah, and open our discussion of the sixth Mishnah. Okay, recently we had the question about an Eruv, so like a community Eruv that permits carrying on Shabbos within a community, whether the posts and strings that's made out of, or since we've been talking about lately, correcting an alleyway so that people that live in that neighborhood, the courtyards that open onto that private lane so that they can carry there on Shabbos. The question was, can we use pre-existing structures for the purpose of the Eruv? Can we use pre-existing structures to make that correction in the private lane? And I said, well, I think so, because I know there's pre-existing structures that are used as part of a community Eruv. Here in Los Angeles, we have, I think, the largest Eruv in the world. It includes many square miles. And for sure, parts of that Eruv use fences and walls that are around the city. Other parts, posts that are attached to light posts and telephone posts and the fishing line above, etc. Some of them are existing posts. Some of them are existing walls. Some are not. But how does it work? So today we're actually looking at that in our page of the Talmud. In fact, that's how we open our discussion. And so we can look right here in this illustration. As you can see, what we have here is an alley. Sorry about the reflections. I'm trying to get an angle that minimizes that. So we have an alley. It's going to be, as we know, according to Beis Hillel, and the law follows Beis Hillel, this alley can be adjusted so that the residents of the courtyards that open into it can carry on Shabbos by way of either a side post or a crossbeam. We don't need both at the opening of the alley. So here, a side post is being used, but it's not a side post that was placed there for the purpose of carrying in the alley. It's a tree that happens to be growing there at the corner of the alley. Now, one of the solutions that's proposed when this is discussed here in the Gemara is, well, maybe it's a tree, but maybe the tree was planted in order to serve as a side post, and that's how we permit it. But that is actually going to be rejected. So there's going to be two principles in this dispute, and it's going to be Abaye, who says, yes, we can use a pre-existing structure, or in this case, a tree, as a sidepost to allow carrying in that alley. And his disputant on this is going to be, it's Rava. So Rava says, no, you can't use a pre-existing structure. Now Rava's basic reason is, look, we've already said that the reason that crossbeam can't be higher than 20 cubits high is because it serves as a marker. It needs to be a conspicuous marker, right? That's why we have an adjustment that is visible, highly visible. It needs to remind people, yes, carrying is going to be permitted in this alley, but it's going to be permitted because we adjusted the alley so that carrying would be permitted there on Shabbos. If we just use a pre-existing structure, well, people aren't going to think about it at all. It just happens to be that it's there, it's convenient, but why would we use that if what we want is that it's conspicuous? Abaye is going to say, doesn't matter. What we want to make sure is that people understand that carrying is permitted there because the rules were followed. And here the rules are, there needs to be a side post, and there is a side post. What we didn't do is remove the tree, right? We might have, perhaps this tree is a kind of oddly placed tree right at the corner of this alley, and we might have removed it, but we left it there so that it would act as a side post. I'm putting words in his mouth, but Abaye says, yes, it is permitted. What is the qualification of that? Now, it has to be, the halakha follows Abaye. So we do follow Abaye. We can use the pre-existing structure, in this case, a tree. But we must have that thing, that pre-existing structure, in place as the side post before Shabbat begins. Now, if it's there before Shabbat begins, it's assumed that the people who are going to use that alley are relying on that tree or other pre-existing structure to be there in order to make the adjustment to the alley so that we can carry there. They don't have to say, I'm relying on that tree. They don't have to make a declaration. They don't even have to have it in their consciousness. It's assumed that they're relying on it if it's already there when Shabbat starts. If it's not there when Shabbat starts, or if we were relying on something different, as we'll see, then the rule is going to change. But as long as that side post is there at the beginning of Shabbos, the fact that it wasn't set up there for the purpose of correcting the alley won't matter. We follow Abaye in this ruling. Likewise, we can use trees, walls of a house, fences on a property as the walls of a sukkah, right? The sukkah that we live in and eat in, that we dwell in during the festival, the fall festival holiday coming up in the not too distant future of Sukkot. So a sukkah has certain requirements, and it's actually many requirements, and we're going to be studying them in detail when we get to tractate sukkahs in the Talmud. Excuse me. But for now, what we're saying is that we can use, just like we can use a tree as a side post for the alley, we can use a tree as one of the walls of a sukkah. A sukkah, it's basically a four-walled structure with a roof. But what's interesting is it's a four-walled structure, but we only need 3 walls, and only 2 of those walls need to be complete. The third wall only has to be a handbreadth wide. We'll understand that when we get to those studies later in our journey. But the important thing is here that just like we can use a pre-existing structure that wasn't made for the sukkah as a wall of the sukkah, likewise we can use a pre-existing structure to make a correction for carrying in the alley. Here's an interesting ruling. Imagine a willow tree, right? So a willow tree, a big willow tree that has all those long draping willow branches hanging around the periphery of the willow tree. If they're thick enough, right? If all those willow branches, they don't have between them more than 3 handbreadths distance, and you can see that a willow tree, they're all pretty close to each other, and they form a kind of a barrier around the outside of the willow tree that often hangs right down to the ground, or at least within 3 handbreadths of the ground. So then if you have that situation, the area around the trunk of the tree and within this kind of curtain of willow branches that surrounds the trunk of the tree even though it's outside in a field, which would be, in a valley, an unfenced area, it's like a Carmelis, basically like a public domain where you can't carry on Shabbos, but within the boundaries of that willow tree, within that curtain of willow branches around the trunk of the tree, we can carry on Shabbos. The limitation on that is if the tree is so vast, if it's such a big tree, I don't know if a tree can be this big, but if a tree is so big that it encloses an area of 2 base sa. So 2 base sa, or se'ah, is 5,000 square cubits. So it's basically about an area of 100 feet by 100 feet. So that's pretty big. I don't think a willow tree can encompass an area that's 100 feet by 100 feet. But once you go beyond that, it's not going to be acceptable to carry within that space. So that's going to be the limit on that. And this limitation of this 5,000 square cubits, it's going to be used in other areas. So we'll see this in a few weeks, but it's interesting. If you have a community Eruv, like in a city around Jerusalem or around so many neighborhoods that are encompassed together here in Los Angeles, if within the Eruv there's like an overgrown field, like that's gone wild, and it's not fenced in so people can walk through it, and if that field within the city, right, it's kind of like, imagine like a rundown area, like just an abandoned property with just lots of weeds on it. And that could be more than 100 feet by 100 feet quite easily. And it's not fenced in. That area within the Eruv will invalidate the Eruv. So it's something that actually communities that have an Eruv have to be very careful about. Okay. We did that. Okay, if we have a situation where walls were built not to serve as side posts, but perhaps it was meant to be a courtyard. They were going to, let's say, fence in this entire alleyway. And here you can get a real nice picture of how these, three-sided alleyways at the courtyards of townhomes open up into it. So this is just a very common kind of living situation in Talmudic times. So let's say they were going to fence off that alley, but they didn't finish the fence. So the wall was not built to act as side posts to permit carrying in that alley. Nevertheless, this works. These half-built walls, it's like a pre-existing structure. It was there before Shabbos, and that will work as side posts to permit carrying in that alley. Now, here's a question I alluded to earlier. What if we have just a regular side post, right? So let's say that there's an alley, and they built a side post there, to a conspicuous side post, more than 10 tefachim high. It could be very thin, as we've seen, but let's say they made it more noticeable just out of principle. Let's say it's 2 handbreadths wide. It's a side post. Everyone looks at that and says, okay, they put a side post here so that carrying would be permitted in this yard. Now, what if that side post falls down on Shabbos? So now it's invalidated. So now we can't carry in that alley anymore because there's no side post there. But what if there was a half-built wall? Some structure like that, some pre-existing structure was there before Shabbos began. It was not being used as a side post. There was an actual side post there, but the side post fell down. Can we now rely on what would count as a pre-existing structure? We just weren't relying on it because we had the proper side post. And we learned this out from an incident. This happened. So it was Rav and Rav Huna were in that situation. Rav sent his assistant to go get a drink for him. And while the assistant was fetching the drink, the side post fell down. So when the assistant came back and was going to hand the drink to Rav, Rav said, no. And he indicated that the side post fell down. You can't give me the drink. Rav Huna said, but look, there's this other thing here. I don't know what was it, a tree? I can't remember what it was. It was something that would work as where was that? I was just going to teach it. I wasn't going to read it. because it doesn't matter that much. Yes. And he signaled him that he should stop. There was a palm tree, right? So there was a palm tree nearby, located in such a position that it could act as the lechi, as the side post. So Rav Huna said to Rav, look, there's a palm tree right there. You can get your drink of water because it can act as the side post for this alley. And Rav said to Rav Huna that if you think that, then you don't understand the law. Why? Because in this case, for sure, we did not rely on that palm tree to be the side post. Now, if it was only the palm tree there wasn't a proper side post, then that is what we would have been relying on to be carrying here since Shabbos began. But since there was a side post, everyone looks at that side post as what permits carrying in the alley. No one thought of the palm tree that way. Now the side post fell down, so we cannot make that assumption that we relied on the palm tree because we know we didn't rely on the palm tree. So carrying would not be permitted in that situation. Okay, Mishnah number 5 here of chapter 1. Please put your questions and comments into the comments. I'm actually approaching the end pretty soon, and then I will be answering them. Nina is at an event today, so she is not going to be feeding me the questions, but hopefully I'll be able to just scan the comments myself and realize which are the questions. Okay, so Mishnah number 5. Side post from anything. Okay, so Mishnah number 5 is that we can make that side post out of anything. Right? It just has to be 10 handbreadths high. As we've seen, it can be very narrow. It can also be wide. That half-built wall was quite wide. We can make it out of anything. And the sages say, we can even make it out of a living animal. There's actually a little figure like that. It's pretty cute. So you see, like here, they're using a donkey or a horse as the side post to permit carrying in the alley. Now, when we look at this, it seems like that's ridiculous, right? Why would you, secure a donkey at the corner of the alley just so that we could carry in the alley? Surely there's a better way to do that. And really, we wouldn't do this so much in the city. But as we'll see in the next example, when you're talking about a caravan going through the wilderness, using animals as fences does make quite a bit of sense when there's nothing else around you. But right now we're talking about the alley, and in the Mishnah it says you could use even a living creature as a side post to permit carrying in the alley. Rabbi Meir says, no, you cannot. A second example given in the Mishnah is that now that we're talking about using living creatures in an unusual way, it says that if a man is giving his wife a bill of divorce, right? So that's called a get. So in Judaism, in traditional Judaism, there certainly is the concept of a divorce. The way divorce works is the man gives the woman a written document. It's written for her. It's called a get, a written document of divorce. What can we write the get upon? Anything, including a living animal. But Rabbi Yosei HaGelili says, no, we can't write it on an animal. Okay. He says no. Now we get into the Gemara discussing this Mishnah. Rabbi Meir says that an animal also may not be used as a sukkah wall, nor as a mechitzos, a partition around a well. But the rabbis apparently say yes. Rabbi Meir disagrees with them, but we can use an animal as a partition. And we're going to come back to that in a moment. But with regard to this bill of divorce, so Rabbi Yosei HaGelili says, how are you going to write that on an animal? The Torah says if you're going to divorce your wife, you have to give her a document. You have to write on a scroll. So whatever you're gonna write upon it, it has to be like a scroll. And Yosei HaGelili defines like a scroll means that it's not a living thing and it's not food. Okay, so it's anything but a living thing or food could function as a scroll. The rabbis disagree. And they say, no, what the performative act, the ikr, the essence of giving the bill of divorce is that you write. It's the writing. It doesn't matter what you write it upon, and they're just giving this extreme example that you could write it on an animal. It's not like anybody would ever write a bill of divorce on an animal, but what we're getting at is the principle. what matters isn't what you write it on. What matters is that it's the writing of the get and the giving it to the wife that creates the divorce, that ends the obligations of the couple to each other, and creates rights for her. Now, in modern times, people will say, this is so patriarchal and old-fashioned and unfair to women because divorce seems to be like a one-way street. Like the man has to give the bill of divorce to the woman. If he refuses to give it, she's stuck. She can't go out and go marry someone else. And this can create big problems. But let's understand that when this law was given in the Torah, in the ancient world, it was absolutely revolutionary and feminist. Because prior to that, in the world, women had zero rights. I mean, just no rights whatsoever. The world was so patriarchal that to say that a woman, when she leaves a marriage is going to have certain rights and the man has to, declare the divorce in front of people. There have to be witnesses. Everyone has to know. Now she's free. She can go marry another man. And not only that, he has to pay her money. There's a lot there that did not exist before. So we shouldn't judge documents from 3,000 years ago according to our standards today. And of course, over time, while in the traditional world, there's still an imbalance between men and women, nevertheless, this can create problems. It rarely creates problems. It doesn't really end up working that way. But let's get back to the issue at hand. The question is, what can the get be written on? The rabbis say it doesn't matter what you write it on, even a living animal, and the halacha follows them. In fact, they note that to get married, to get betrothed, so that a couple is promised to each other, which is essentially that they're married. Once they're betrothed, even though they haven't sort of completed and consummated the marriage, they're already promised to each other, and that means they're prohibited to everyone else. They don't need a written document in order to become betrothed to each other. There's various ways that it can be done. There can be an exchange, like he gives her a gift, or even he gives her money. Money changes hands. He gives to her, not to her father, to her, and then they are betrothed. But to get divorced, to tear up this relationship, that requires writing. That requires writing. It can only be done with writing. While we're talking about divorce, it's really off the topic of creating an eruv for carrying on Shabbos. But since we've started talking about divorce, the Gemara gives us a couple more teachings. A bill of divorce that is conditional, if the condition is onerous at all, is not a bill of divorce. So example, a husband could say to the wife, I will divorce you if you do not go to Disneyland for a week, right? So that's pretty easy to do. She doesn't go to Disneyland for a week. She's fulfilled her part she's fulfilled the condition under which the get was given. Now they're divorced. But if this husband, who's a control freak, and wants to divorce her, but doesn't want his kids to ever go to Disneyland because he doesn't believe that Disneyland is healthy for kids, and he says, I divorce you on condition that you never take the kids to Disneyland, ever, right? So for years, a condition that's in place for many years, that is not a bill of divorce. That is not a valid bill of divorce. Nothing about that arrangement is kosher. So they're not divorced, and they haven't tried to get divorced, right? That he can't control her after they're divorced. This is another way in which a woman's rights were absolutely respected, even in the ancient world. Now we come to our discussion of Mishnah number 6, and now we're talking about a caravan of animals. So imagine a caravan going through the desert. They're riding camels, right? So it's like a caravan. Who knows how many people are in a caravan? 100? Maybe 100 camels. They're carrying, lots of stuff. It's the spice trade. Maybe they're going as far as China. Maybe they're going to Mongolia. Maybe they're just going to Saudi Arabia. Wherever they are, they're moving around the Middle East in a caravan. And they're traveling, and they're going to be traveling for a long time. Those caravans would go for months on their journey. So certainly they'd be on the road during Shabbos. But they can't keep traveling on Shabbos. So for Shabbos, they're going to encamp, right? They're going to observe Shabbos even while the caravan is moving. This is a Jewish caravan. So they stop for Shabbos. They make an encampment. And the question is there going to be an enclosure within which they can carry on Shabbos, right? So they're going to have an encampment, and one guy has his little tent over here, and he wants to go visit his buddy who's in a tent over there. Can he bring some bread from his tent to his buddy's tent? Answer, yes, if they make a proper enclosure. Now, they're not carrying, fences to make a proper enclosure on Shabbos. So what is this mechitza, what is this partition going to look like that they're going to use to surround the encampment? Answer, the animals, right? So if the camels kneel around the perimeter of their encampment, and they take off the camel saddles, and they take off the gear and the load, the cargo that the camels are carrying, and they sort of pile that up. Okay, so they have to make it so that the circle is small enough so that the fences there's as much fence as gaps, right? That's the key. In fact, there needs to be a little bit more fence than gap in order to be sure. The parts that are fences, that are acting as fences, the kneeling camels, the cargo, the saddles, they have to be 10 handbreadths off the ground, 10 handbreadths high, so about 40 inches high. And then there has to be more partition than breach, more fence than gap between the fence parts. And then they're going to have a valid enclosure. One condition to that, one qualification to that is a leniency, is that openings between the parts, which are 10 cubits wide or less, don't even really count as breaches because they count as entrances, right? They count as entrances. And that's how we understand a figure that we've seen before, especially we talked about this in Tractate Shabbos, and it was a little bit hard to understand. So what we have here is a well in a public domain, in a public thoroughfare. Now, can we take water out of that well on Shabbos? If we don't make these partitions around the well, no, we cannot, because the well itself is its own private domain. Its sides are more than 10 handbreadths deep, and the bottom of it is more than 4 by 4 cubits. So or is it 4 by 4 handbreadths? Now, I think it's 4 by 4 handbreadths. So this is a public domain, a private domain within a public domain. So if you pull water out of that, then you've transferred from private domain to public domain on Shabbos, and you would have committed a transgression. So what do? We put a fence around the well so that the well is within a private domain, and now we can pull the water out and drink it. But as you can see, the fence which is surrounding the well isn't much of a fence at all. Oops, let me get this right. It's not much of a fence at all. It's just these two corner pieces made out of some kind of wall, another corner which is made out of sticks, and then the fourth corner is just a tree that happens to be sitting there. And for sure, the gaps are bigger than the partitions. There's much more gap around that well than there is partition around that well. So why is it kosher to pull water out of that well and drink it on Shabbos? Because those openings between the kosher partitions are 10 cubits or less. And so they're not considered fences that are collapsed or fences that are missing. Rather, those are entrances between valid partitions. So those partitions are probably 3 handbreadths wide. And so what's between them are the openings. And so that's why this is going to work. Okay. I did that. What if in the caravan encampment, right, where the partitions are made of camels and cargo and camel saddles, etc. What if the breaches, the open areas, exactly equal the fences, right? That there's not more fence than breach and not more breach than fence, but it's exactly equal. So Rav Papa would permit carrying there, and Rav Huna, the son of Rav Yehoshua, would prohibit carrying there. They're going to disagree on what is the definition. Do we actually need the fences to exceed the breaches, or is equal good enough? We know that if the fences are less than the breaches, for sure we can't carry there. Very Talmudic question. What if they're exactly equal? To help us understand that, this is the last thing we're going to talk about today. We go back to the sukkah. A sukkah roof has to be covered with schach. Schach is usually like palm branches or branches from any tree really, but especially palm branches get used. But it has to be something that grew from the ground and which has been detached from the ground and which sits on the roof. And which, has more shade than sun, but at night we can look through it and see some stars. Now, very often what holds up the roof of this roofing material, it's got to rest on something. It's all just kind of loose palm branches. What do they rest on? They rest on beams. The beams are not schach, right? The beams are solid, so they don't count as the actual roofing. Well, what if you have a lot of beams? And you can imagine a pergola. Sometimes pergolas have very thick beams that are pretty close together. So at what point is there too much beam and not enough schach to be the roof of the sukkah? So the answer is that when you look up, it's okay to see a lot of beams, but there has to be more schach, right? As you look up, you have to see more of the standard sukkah roofing than the beams, which are solid and which would not count as a kosher roof for a sukkah. So there has to be a little bit more of the loose branches as an area of the ceiling, or sometimes it's bamboo slats, anything like that. That kosher schach, it has to occupy more area of the roof than those solid beams, which would not work as the roofing material for a sukkah. Okay, that's what I've got for us. I would say that our takeaway at this point, we've seen a lot of different areas. We've talked about that you can use an animal as a side post. You can use a tree as a side post. Once we got onto the subject of an animal as a side post, we learned you could even write a bill of divorce on an animal, because where the question is, what is the essence of the thing that we're doing? What is the essence of the thing that we're doing? When we're adjusting an alley so that we can carry there, what is the essence of the thing that we're doing? Is we're joining some private properties together so that the people who live in that community can visit each other. They have to know that this alley has somehow been adjusted. A pre-existing structure can work, but it has to have been in place before Shabbat began, and they would have to, over time, they're aware of why it is that they can carry. So the rabbis are always playing this role of being legislators who are trying to, help people, prevent people from coming to make transgressions. But they're also legislators in the sense that they can't overburden the people with the rabbinic corrections that they're going to need to make so that they're protected from coming to make transgressions. And there's always this balancing act. All right. Let me see if you've got questions. Okay, so Danielle Mintz says, I don't have a question, but can you mention that a Yid from Sao Paulo, Brazil is amazed by the wisdom of the Talmud in the merit of your shiurim, in the merit of your classes? Well, thank you so much, Danielle. I really appreciate that. And I had the question earlier today because I was wearing this same t-shirt this morning for the shofar blowing. What is a Yid? Someone asked. And why is that on my shirt? So a Yid is just a Jew. It's the Yiddish word for Jew. It's what we call ourselves. Now, when I first made these t-shirts, and you can get them in our store, so shop.accidentaltalmudist.org, lots of other shirts too. All proceeds go to our nonprofit. So somebody said, how could you have a t-shirt that says Yid on it? Yid is a dirty word. It's what Jew haters call Jews as an insult, and will even use that term, to describe non-Jews where they want to insult them by saying they have qualities of Jewish people. It's an insult, and I say that's awful. It's awful that it was ever used that way, and I'm not going to allow some Jew hater to tell me that I can't use the language of my people, Yiddish, and particularly the name we call ourselves, because some Jew hater misappropriated that term as an insult. So if that's true and people actually think of it that way, perhaps of an older generation, so we're taking it back. Yid is a word to be very proud of. I am a proud Yid. Okay. Let's see. Is there a question? Christo Cheney says, always important to understand the Tanakh, the Bible, and the Talmud as products of their time. So you're probably referring to the discussion we had earlier about the get, the bill of divorce, and preferably in their original languages if possible. I'm currently working on that now. Absolutely. I went to Hebrew school for years. I certainly didn't learn Hebrew. Like so many, Jews in a kind of liberal Jewish education, we learn enough to read Hebrew for our bar mitzvah. We don't learn to speak it or understand it. Since I reconnected with the faith of my ancestors 20 years ago, I've taken classes. I certainly read the Hebrew. I go very slowly and try to understand the words. And I know a lot more now about how the language operates and what the words mean than I knew before. And every time I try to study a prayer in the original, it's incredible. Like it comes off the page, it comes alive. So I certainly recommend, like this is a Shabbos Siddur, the Art Scroll series. I've mentioned these before. This is an Art Scroll interlinear translation, right? Where you'll see the prayer and the English is directly under the word, right? And so you can go word by word. And once you start to understand how Hebrew is constructed, it's totally different than English. I mean, the syntax and the grammar is so different. And Hebrew has far fewer words. Because of that, it's a very moody and poetic language. And the same word gets used in different situations for different things. And that's why you see the same word translated, into English differently all the time, even within the same psalm or prayer. And as you start to understand these different meanings that the words carry, these different valences, these different moods and feelings, it's beautiful. It really opens up the text. It opens up scripture. God created this world as a place where God is hidden. That's like the point of this world, so that the creatures in this world have an independence, can decide what they're going to do for themselves. They're not overwhelmed by the presence of God as we are in the world of souls that we come from. So here we're free. We're free, right? We're free to make our own decisions about how we're going to connect with each other, how we're going to connect with God, whether we're going to make that connection or not. We can choose. As the Talmud says, everything is in the hands of heaven except fear of heaven. That is left up to us. But God intruded in history so that we would have this eternal guide of what is right and what is wrong, what we should do and what we should not do. And that the Bible is that source of eternal values. And it was given in Hebrew. So we can learn it very well in English. But when we get into the Hebrew, it's better. I would teach you more Hebrew. I'm just not expert enough to do it. I'll try to bring in more of the things that I've learned that are meaningful to me, maybe than I have been. And at times, I'll try to bring somebody in here who's really good at doing the translation and making it come alive in English. I'm thinking my friend Adam Kligfeld, amazing at that. At any rate. Okay. Joyce Oxfeld says, my Hebrew never got where I wanted either. Exactly. And it's never too late, says Tom Beck. Amen. Okay, I go over to Lynn on the YouTube side. And she says, when it says written on a living animal, I thought it was as if on a table, like turn around and bend down and I will place my notebook on your back as a hard surface to write. But on the animal? Yeah, on the animal. You could just write it on the animal. I don't know how they would do it. Perhaps they would shave the hair off and then just write it on its skin. I would doubt that a bill of divorce was ever actually written on a living animal. But if it happened for some reason and the couple needed to get a divorce and there was no paper or any other document around for miles, they could do it because what matters is the writing. Now, I wonder if this is, Gittin is a whole tractate of the Talmud about this subject. I suspect that you can't write it in the dirt. I don't remember, but I don't think you can write it in the sand where it's so ephemeral that it isn't really a document. It has to somehow have some permanence. And maybe an animal is actually better than, for example, a rock, because the animal will eventually die, and then you can take its hide, and that's what parchment is. I mean, at the end of the day, you would have the same skin with writing on it if it was written after the animal died or before, whereas a rock might not take the ink in a way, and she wants that bill of divorce. She needs to have that. That is a document that is important for her to have. It protects her. Maggie Scott says, Hebrew is so strange with how a word can mean so many different things. Like bevakasha, it can be please, or you're welcome, or here you go, crazy. Where can I get the book? I'm sorry, if we're talking about an interlinear translation, these are at Amazon, but what you're looking for is just Art Scroll makes this series. They have sitters, they have the whole Torah as an interlinear translation. They have lots of different texts with interlinear translation. So go to artscroll.com or go to Amazon. I think a lot of their books are available there. Okay, that is what I've got for us today. I don't think I've missed any questions. It's been great to learn with you guys. As I said, this is Elul. So watch for our shofar blast tomorrow morning. We do it every morning. Today we had if you didn't see today's, go look at that post now, because I told a story about a shofar blown in Siberia during Rosh Hashanah in the 1940s. Incredible story. The story of Rebbe Sinai Halberstam and his grandson Meir Halberstam. That's something worth listening to. It won't take very long, but you got to hear that story. It is also customary to support charitable organizations, especially ones that promote Torah study in the world. So during Elul, it's great to rack up mitzvahs, as it were, as we come near the end of the year. We're going to come before the heavenly throne for judgment, and we want heaven to be compassionate on us, so we show compassion on our fellow creatures by donating to charitable causes. If you want to support us, donate.accidentaltalmudist.org. Have a great evening, my holy sisters and brothers, and I look forward, with God's help, to see